New Thought Media Network. We are
Hey everybody, we seem to be having some technology challenges here today. So that's what happens with the live broadcasts. And we are just going to go with it and see if we can keep going without the videos. And I even have a couple of extras planned in for today, so take a breath with me. What I know is absolutely true is that the wisdom of spirit is always available and always seeking to express itself, to expand love and wisdom throughout the universe in every way possible. And so I simply relax into this knowing that because that is true, everything that is required for today's conversation, today's presentation, today's exploration of inclusion in New Thought spiritual communities is available right here and right now, and is excited to be delivered in a form planned and unplanned. This is what I know to be true. And I'm grateful for knowing that I can simply relax and be in the present moment. And I invite everyone within the sound of my voice to be in the present moment. And so it is. So, what are we going to talk about today? We are going to explore the idea of metaphysical Bible interpretation and why that is important if you are committed to building and maintaining an inclusive spiritual community. This came up as part of the conversation last week, and I was captured by the idea of, there's a whole discussion or conversation we can have about the metaphysical interpretation of the Bible and whether or not it should be included. But I'm particularly interested in why we would have that conversation and how it relates to creating an inclusive church, growing your church, being able to have a church where people from different backgrounds come to, especially New Thought, from wherever they are now, and then are able to integrate that into how they live their commitment to New Thought principles. And so I thought a lot about how, number one, what did I think about it? And then number two, how can I share information? What information can I share that will get you thinking about it as well? So I had to go back to really the basic question of, is metaphysical interpretation of the Bible important in New Thought? And that was easy for me. Like, historically, yes. And we can't even really talk about New Thought as we know New Thought is today without referring to the Bible, right? Because most early New Thought traditions, you look at the founding of unity churches, of the divine science movement, of religious science or science of mind, of UFBL, Universal Foundation for Better Living. But if we go back to the early ones, unity, divine science, religious science, they used the Bible as a primary teaching text. Like, the founders of those organizations were influenced heavily and taught by I'm distracted by the challenges, by Mary Baker Eddy and by Emma Curtis Hopkins. Like they learned healing modalities from teachers who were teaching about the metaphysical interpretation of what is in the Bible. And if you read the early New Thought teachings, you will find many references to biblical scripture and then those scriptures being interpreted from a metaphysical perspective. And so all of the lessons that are in the Bible about the creative power of thought or the unity of God and humanity, or the way that God and humanity, what is God, what is human, and how do those interact, or how are they related, right? The whole foundation for transformation being grounded in a spiritual consciousness. And so when you look at the history of New Thought, then there was no question that you would take the Bible and then interpret it from a mystical, metaphysical, prophetic way. So when we are talking about a metaphysical interpretation of the Bible, we are talking about being able to look at biblical characters and how they represent different states of consciousness, of our consciousness, of the way that we think about and approach life. When we talk about the metaphysical interpretation of the Bible, then we are beginning to really look at miracles are simply spiritual and physical laws interacting, right? A miracle is a shift in awareness or a shift in consciousness that then produces a different result. And if we look at the pattern historically, then the stories in the Bible are designed to illustrate spiritual law more so than historical events. And so, is metaphysical interpretation of the Bible important in New Thought? It was easy for me to come to the answer of absolutely yes. And so that was kind of easy, building on the question from last week, which wasn't, is it important, but how do I learn more about it? And how do I begin to understand New Thought? And how do I bridge what I may have learned growing up in reference to the Bible? How do I bridge that to what I'm learning and believing and practicing in New Thought? And so the core thing to remember, I think, is that in New Thought, when we're looking at the Bible, the core principle is not the Bible itself. The core principle is, or the goal is to understand spiritual law and consciousness. And the Bible has been a traditional vehicle for teaching those ideas. Now we know it's not the only vehicle for understanding metaphysics, but there are so many examples of how that has been used in New Thought. And so if you want to go back in history, some of the major authors that you might want to read, of course, Emma Curtis Hopkins, which, she was the teacher of teachers, and the founders of the early New Thought denominations all studied with her in one way or another. And so that's why she's called the teacher of teachers. From that time, she trained so many leaders who later founded New Thought movements or went on to write and practice New Thought principles. And she really taught that the language of the Bible was symbolically a spiritual philosophy. And I remember the first time that I read Scientific Christian Mental Practice, that my mind was just blown, right? My mind was just blown. And that it was a chance for me to really see scripture not as doctrine, like denominational doctrine, but it's a spiritual principle. It applies to everyone, it applies to everything. And so her book, Scientific Christian Mental Practice, is like a foundational book if you're trying to begin to build a bridge from the Bible you may have studied or learned about growing up, or if you're just talking to people who are very grounded in the Bible. Another reference, historical reference, would be reading Charles Fillmore's Metaphysical Bible Dictionary or the 12 Powers of Man. He co-founded the Unity movement, and he was very methodical in laying out how to take what's written here in the Bible and use it as a map to understand and develop consciousness. Myrtle Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, also had some really great writings. Myrtle Fillmore's Healing Letters, I like to refer people to, because it was a collection of letters that she wrote related to healing, and then they were to different people, but then they were collected together as a collection of healing letters, where she really builds a great bridge in terms of not just the philosophy and understanding it, but the practical application of the consciousness that then especially leads to healing. And she translated a lot of biblical philosophy into daily spiritual practice. Now, of course, anybody who knows me knows that I'm going to not skip over Ernest Holmes. And he was the founder of religious science. He wrote the book Science of Mind. And he really presented Jesus as the example, not the exception, and that Jesus was the example of universal spiritual law. And so you can't read, I often just say you can't read 10 pages in the Science of Mind, but you probably can't read more than 3 or 4 pages without some scriptural biblical reference, or reference to the example that Jesus taught. And so the Science of Mind as a book itself, but I went to my bookshelf and said, like, what are books that I have that are showing this link between the Bible and New Thought? And I found about 10 of them, 10 or 11 of them. And one of them was The Hidden Power of the Bible, What Science of Mind Reveals About the Bible and You. And it's excerpts of things that Ernest Holmes wrote about the Bible. And then there's a book, Words That Heal Today, by Ernest Holmes, that really is what really takes a lot of what's in the New Testament. Like the note to myself inside the book cover of my copy of Words That Heal Today is, this is the Jesus book, right? And the note to myself for when I'm teaching, when students want to bridge Science of Mind and Jesus, or the Bible in general, refer them to this book. So this is a more recent version of Words That Heal Today. But in Science of Mind, there are numerous examples of why the metaphysical interpretation of the Bible is so foundational to who we are and what we do. Another author that's not connected to founding a movement within New Thought is Emmett Fox. Emmett Fox gets quoted a lot or referred to a lot when you begin to think about the metaphysical interpretation of New Thought principles and philosophies. He's written a lot of books, but especially his book, The Sermon on the Mount, The Key to Success in Life, where he takes the Sermon on the Mount from the Bible and breaks it down into consciousness and the metaphysical interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount as true instructions for transforming consciousness. And that's what we do in New Thought. Now, there's some other authors that I think about as well that are specific to this bridge between biblical scripture and metaphysics. And one of them is Sarah Flowers, that I love. And Sarah Flowers and how she took in building the metaphysical thesaurus, that she took words and then compared them, or maybe even in Common Sense, the book where every page she took a scripture, she took a condition that we might want to change. And if we were going to use spiritual technology to make that change, there's a Bible reference and then there's a metaphysical reference. And so in the Sarah Flowers book, Common Sense, every page has a connection to, here's what we say metaphysically, here's what the Bible said, here's your affirmation. Now let's shift this condition and get what we want instead of moving away and move away from what we don't want. Also, in modern day, someone who's been doing that in the 21st century is Dr. Alma Marie Stevens. And she has an entire series of 7 books that are set up similar to what I just described with Sarah Flowers, in that you decide what you want to focus on creating or eliminating. And then in her book, she has a connection to, here is the Bible reference of a scripture that will unlock or break that up. And here's the metaphysical, and then here's a devotion and an affirmation. So Dr. Alma Marie Stevens. What do you feel is the difference between a metaphysical or a meta-relational interpretation of the universal principles from which the New Thought movement is founded? I don't know that I have an opinion about that at all. I don't know if I've ever even thought about it before, Marjorie. So why don't you post what you think the difference is between a metaphysical or meta-relational interpretation. So for me, the way I define metaphysics, for me, automatically includes the activity, which for me automatically includes the relationships between people, or between people and animals, or people and inanimate objects. So I've not invested even 5 minutes on that. The question's never been framed to me that way, but I think it's going to be a question that I think more about. In the meantime, if you have a short summary of what it means to you and the difference between them, I would love it if you would drop it in the chat, and then we'll add that into this conversation today. I love that you always ask great questions. Most of the time, things I've thought about, but today, something I've never, ever considered that I recall. So, and if you too have a comment or a question, please drop it in the comment section or the chat section, depending on which platform you are on, and we'll just weave that in if it's at all possible. So, this conversation about is metaphysical Bible interpretation or metaphysical interpretation of the Bible important in New Thought? I am saying yes. And that was an easy one for me. And some of the references to the history of a metaphysical interpretation of the Bible has always been a part of New Thought, which is like why I highlighted some of the authors that if you want to go back in time and see how they built the bridge, then you can do that. And if you're involved in a church or a spiritual community, you may have seen classes being offered, metaphysical Bible classes. You might have been asked to take in or work on affirmations or build affirmations that started with biblical scripture. For example, be still and know that I am God, right? The biblical scripture, be still and know that I am God. And in New Thought, we might turn that into an affirmation that I rest in the divine presence within me. Be still and know that I am God. I rest in the divine presence that is within me. And using affirmations that are built on that kind of biblical core spiritual principle or knowledge is not unusual in New Thought. A lot of the conversations about abundance and prosperity are based on principles of consciousness, not supernatural, miracles or supernatural occurrences. Right? And there's all other kinds of ways that come to mind. If you were with me last winter, or like in December of last year or several years before that, then you may remember that I actually don't celebrate Christmas, but I do a ritual every year that is rebirthing Christ consciousness. And so, in many New Thought communities, even if they do celebrate Christmas, there is a conversation about what we're really doing is we are celebrating the opportunity to rebirth or birth again our Christ consciousness, to bring that forward our in our way of being every day. Easter is coming up, and we focus in the thought on the Bible stories related to Easter, but we interpret them based on the resurrection of our spiritual identity, right? And so using the Bible as a source, but again, as I said earlier, not as the story as a literal, but the story as a spiritual consciousness or a guide for our spiritual journey. David Alexander says the connection demonstrates one of the essential ways that New Thought is a liberation teaching. The early work was not only about liberating the individual from sickness or disease, but it was equally about liberating scripture from dogma and from limited interpretation. And so this is really important for us to remember because we weren't physically present in the early days of what we now refer to as New Thought. And we can put it all together, right, by watching not only what has happened, but what we are also doing with the teaching, that we've got the individual, but we also have the ability to build this bridge away from scripture as dogma and look at a more universal application of it. Okay, Marjorie, now actually I'm going to track with you, but this whole idea of meta relationality is an ontological orientation that focuses on the dynamic, embedded, and often non-linear relationships and entanglements between entities. And so the question then becomes, or one of the questions then becomes, if we are going to do an interpretation of biblical scripture and use that in our New Thought spiritual communities, how do we, right? That's the question. How do we then apply it in a broader sense, than just taking it literally? So I am watching the time, because when I'm not with a guest, I generally try very hard to stay within 30 to 35 minutes. I can tell you right now, I'm going to go longer than that, but I promise I won't go longer than 45 minutes, because laying this foundation is important. Like, what is the metaphysical interpretation of the Bible? And why is it important? How can I get more information about that and how it has been done? But I want to get to, I'm going to skip over a couple of things, because what I want to get to is, why should we care if we are committed to having an inclusive church, an inclusive spiritual community, right? I could do 2 hours just on metaphysics, or metaphysics and the Bible interpretation in the conversation itself, as if we were in a class on that topic. But if we are in a class, it's a class about what should we pay attention to, because we've made a commitment to be inclusive. And part of the way this came up last week was the whole concern, or the big concern, about how do we bring people into our spiritual communities who have a background in the Bible, that they're coming from a Christian church where they learned a lot about the Bible, and then they come into a New Thought church, a New Thought spiritual community. Like, are we building a bridge? We have had people come into our churches, and then they're like, well, wait, you don't talk about Jesus. I can't be a part of anything that doesn't talk about Jesus. Or, wait a minute, I want a relationship with Jesus. And where is that? And if you go historically into New Thought and the foundations before New Thought, that was very, very present. If you go to Universal Foundation for Better Living, UFBL churches, you will find that Bible connection and the Jesus connection very, very, very strong. And because in the way that it has developed, they have maintained that. But if you go into some other communities, some other New Thought communities, or individual churches or denominations, you may not find that. And so the idea that if we are wanting to grow, not just for numbers' sake, we are wanting to grow because we know the message we have in New Thought is meaningful for people who are looking for answers in their lives today, then we cannot afford, Tracy's opinion, we cannot afford to turn our backs on the Bible. And so the metaphysical interpretation of the Bible actually does help to remove this religious literalism, or the dogma that people may have grown up with or may have learned before, some of the ideas that they may have been taught from a different perspective. But if we don't bring it up, if we don't explain it, if we don't teach it, then it's left out there, or it's left a part of their thinking about religion in general. We also, in the metaphysical interpretation, we get to universalize the idea of the Christ, not a person, but the Christ. And so you can really look at global wisdom traditions and begin to pull those in as well, since so many New Thought ministries do draw from Buddhism and Hinduism and Kemet and different ancient ways of being, indigenous wisdom. One of my favorite books a couple of years ago was, and I think I pulled it, I did, the First Nations version of the New Testament, an indigenous translation of the New Testament. Well, in indigenous cultures that really are focused on earth-based traditions and the land and the people and a sense of community, so much of it is universal spiritual principle, just like what we teach in New Thought, but it's attached to a specific group. And it allowed me to do a few classes where we were focused on universal spiritual principle, and we were able to refer to the Christian Bible and passages in the New Testament, and then passages that were here in the First Nations version. So there are many, many ways to say we're pulling all the universal principles, not the dogma about how you should practice or what you should and shouldn't do, and definitely away from the idea of punishment and condemnation, and teaching a new way to take all of that in. So, Anita, I agree with you 100%. I think that just like the multiple interpretations of scripture, you could get multiple metaphysical interpretations of the same concept, depending on who you talk to and what their lived experience is. Yes, yes, and yes. And part of what that reminds me to say is that one of the beauties, right, of having an inclusive spiritual community is you do get to explore what are the different perspectives, what are they based upon, and how do they come together. And so it's not that there's going to be one perfect or only one right way, but you will find across New Thought that there are going to be more similarities. For example, if we were to take the 23rd Psalm and we took different people saying from a metaphysical interpretation, what does this mean? It's not going to be identical sentence by sentence, word for word, but there's going to be a common thread that goes through. And I've seen that example happen actually, even in a class where everybody was studying science of mind. But the assignment was, take the 23rd Psalm and do a metaphysical interpretation of it. And it was fascinating to see where the overlap was and where the differences or distinctions were. And it led to a really, really rich conversation that ultimately took us all back to, what do I really believe about God, the universe, love, a higher power? What do I really believe? And how is that showing up in my life based on how I interpreted this scripture? And so I don't think it's unhealthy for there to be some different interpretation. I think what's unhealthy is if it's different interpretations and people can't talk about it to find what is the common thing what are the common things that are in alignment with what we have already stated as a universal spiritual principle. Because otherwise, if it's just my personal opinion, then it's not in the absolute, right? I can interpret the absolute in a variety of ways, but if it's something that cannot be backed up by universal spiritual principle, then it might just be my opinion versus an actual metaphysical interpretation. It could be a Tracy physical interpretation and not necessarily a metaphysical, beyond the physical into absolute spiritual law interpretation. So I shared some people that you can go back and read if you want to, or look up online. I answered the question, what is metaphysics and why is it important in New Thought? I made the connection to the foundations of New Thought being very much grounded in biblical scripture, interpreting it beyond the literal, right? Beyond the literal, metaphysics beyond the physical, beyond the literal. And the primary point that all of this is important because we have people who are hungry for understanding spiritual principle and learning to apply it in their lives. If they come to our churches, our spiritual communities, our classes, our activities, and we don't address it at all to build a bridge, we will lose them. If they come to our communities, and I think this is worse, if they come to our churches and our communities and what they hear is Bible bashing or Jesus bashing and saying, oh, that has no value, or what you learned is wrong in terms of negative, then negative and hopeless versus here is another way to look at it, then we also are pushing them away. And so it's not just to add numbers, it is to reach the people for whom New Thought philosophy and New Thought practices can help them have the lives they most want to have. And that's what we want to do, or that's what we say we want to do. So this is why we're talking about it on The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. And I want to encourage you to join in every Tuesday at noon Mountain Time, where we dive into topics and ideas and conversations that allow us to really think about what does it take to be inclusive? Who are the people we need to talk about? What can I do in my own spiritual community that allows for inclusion and maybe even demands inclusion? What skills can I give people? And how do we make this change? So join me next Tuesday, noon Mountain Time, right here on the New Thought Media Network. Bye for now. Have a great week.
Thanks for watching The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Join us again next week at 12 noon Mountain Time.